What is overbetting? So overbetting is essentially when a player decides to bet more that's in the pot. And traditionally, in poker, if there's 2,000 in the pot, you wouldn't see a player bet more than 2,000. They're going to bet in the neighborhood of, 1,000, 1,500, but very rarely, especially, 10, 15 years ago, did you ever see players overbetting. Not until a player by the name of Victor Blom, who was known as Isildur online, he started to use this as part of his strategy, where he was putting players in really tough spots by betting twice the size of the pot. So if there's 1,000 in there, he'd bet 2,000, which really has a major impact on the percentage of hands your opponent can call with. It's a very, very tricky move that you can use. And it's important to understand, why would anyone make an overbet, okay? So why would you ever choose this as a strategy? Well, there's a couple reasons why. Obviously, one is when you actually have a nutted hand where you're super strong and you want to get maximum value. So if your opponent, if there's 2,000 out there, if your opponent would call 1,500, but would also call 5,000, well, obviously the better bet would be to bet 5,000. So what condition has to be present for that to be a possibility? Well, you have to have your opponent's range as being very, very strong, except yours is slightly stronger. So when you're looking for value with an overbet, you want to make sure you're identifying their range as being quite strong, because that's more likely to get paid off. The advent of overbetting is essentially a new sort of pricing for how much you're charging to see your hand, right? And really the way it's developed is there are certain hands that your opponents are going to have that they like their hand, they're going to call 1,000, they're going to call 2,000, they're going to call 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000, where there are other hands that you may price out, right? So you have to be thinking in terms of your opponent's range and realize that you should be pricing according to that range to get the desired result. So again, if you think your opponent has a very, very strong hand and will call a big bet and you have a better hand, well, now that's a spot where you might want to bet the maximum amount you think you can get away with, right? Whereas let's say you, in the same situation, you don't think your opponent has very much. Well, you can make a much smaller bet sometimes with two possible variables that could happen. One, you get paid in a spot that you might not over. Two, maybe your opponent sees that as weakness and decides to go for a bluff raise in a spot where they wouldn't have even called. They're like, well, I don't have anything, I'm not going to call, but maybe I can raise you off the hand. So being able to price correctly is a super important aspect of playing poker. And the fact that overbetting is now something that's a tool you can use in your arsenal, you can really maximize value and also win pots that were not available to you before because there was no bet amount that the opponent was going to fold to. Now, maybe with a 2x pot or a 3x pot, that top pair is something your opponent looks at and says, I don't know, I'm going to lay this one down. So what situations would you look for where you're going to bluff as an overbet? Typically, you're going to bluff as an overbet when you think your opponent has a marginal hand. Now, he's going to have a hand where if you bet half the pot or 2/3 of the pot, they're probably going to call, and that won't be good for you since you're bluffing. So maybe it's a case where, you know what, you bet twice the pot, you bet 3 times the pot, 5 times the pot maybe if you're really going for it. Not that I advise doing that very often, but the point is it's very, very important to understand your opponent's range when choosing to overbet. If you don't have a good idea of what your opponent has, then overbetting isn't going to be a very valuable tool for you, right? When you flop, for example, on a king-8 deuce board, and you've got pocket deuces. Your opponent called a bet on the flop. The turn was a jack. Your opponent called another big bet on the turn. Now the river's like a 4. Well, your opponent's very likely to have at least a king here, right? So the fact that he has a king, maybe he even has king-jack, this might be a situation with your small set that's hidden since you don't block any of it, where you can make a big overbet and get paid handsomely, right? And conversely, you look at a situation where, a flop comes jack 8-4, your opponent called a bet. The turn is like a 6. Your opponent, check called a bet. And then the river's an ace. And you were the pre-flop raiser. Well, that's a situation where if he checks, it's very unlikely that he's going to have 2 pair or a set. So you could potentially use that ace as a scare card and make an overbet as a bluff if you had a hand like a gut shot straight and just missed or something like that. So when using overbetting, understand that you should be balanced. It shouldn't be just, I overbet when I have it or I overbet when I bluff. You want to have some bluffs and you want to have some value hands and you want to clearly identify the ranges you're up against to know when this will work. So obviously the overbet is designed to get you maximum value, but we have to consider how do blockers play into that? So let's say you have the absolute nuts where you have pocket kings and the flop came king, 7, deuce. Okay? So you have 3 kings. You can't possibly lose right now. The turn is a 4. The river's a 10. So there's no way you could possibly lose. You have the absolute mortal nuts. Is this a situation where if your opponent called a bet on the flop and called a bet on the turn, where it's a good spot to overbet on the river? And I'm going to say no. And why do I say no? Think about this for a moment, okay? Blockers matter, right? So if you have 2 of the kings, right? How many kings are left? There's only 1 king left. So how strong can your opponent's hand really be when he called flop and turn? Maybe he has 3 sevens or 3 deuces, but if he did, you probably would have heard from him by now. And if he does, he's probably going to, raise you anyway. So you're going to do just fine like that. So you want to be conscious of blockers. That same situation with the king, 7, deuce. For an overbet, you're better off having the deuces or the 7s than the kings, because the 3 kings, even though that's the stronger hand and the others are not the nuts, the 3 kings block too many hands that you want to get called by. So we've discussed situations where it makes sense to overbet for value, but what about when you're bluffing? What about when you're trying to steal the pot? So let's take a look at an example where you're going to incorporate blockers to make this decision. Let's say you've raised with king, queen, and the flop comes jack, 9, 4. Well, you bet this flop. You have a pretty decent hand with 2 overcards and an inside straight. Now it doesn't materialize with a deuce on the turn. Your opponent checks, and you go ahead and decide that, you know what? I don't think my opponent's very strong. I'm blocking some hands, which we'll get to on the river. So you go ahead and bet again. And your opponent calls. And now let's say the river is another deuce. Well, it's unlikely either player hit that card. Your opponent checks. This is the kind of hand that blocks what? So if you have king, queen, you block queen, jack, king, jack, pocket kings, pocket queens. Now, it's still possible your opponent has a jack 10 or a jack 4 suited or something along those lines. But the point is, you block a lot of the strong hands that he may call with. So this may be a situation where if your opponent does have a jack 10, for example, they might call 2/3 of the pot. They might call half the pot if that's what you choose to bluff with. What if you bet twice the pot in this situation? Now you're putting extra pressure in a situation, and you're doing it with information. You're doing it because you're blocking specific hands that will probably call you in this situation. And if you didn't have any of those blockers, it makes your bluff less effective. So if you're playing poker today, you're probably seeing some overbets, and sometimes it may cause you a lot of stress, right? And you might be thinking, I don't know about this. I don't know how to handle that. Well, the good news is we've equipped you to handle these situations with the simple formula for what your fold frequency should be in a standard situation. So what is that frequency? We've talked about it already. It is the bet divided by the pot plus bet, right? So for example, let's say you are on the river, and there's 1,000 in the pot, and your opponent's bet 3,000. Okay? So we know now that our fold frequency is 3/4, 75%. So what does that mean exactly? That means we should, theoretically, fold 75% of the time. So whatever our range is at that point, we can just say, okay, we should call with the top 25% of the range and then fold the rest. So if you have one of your stronger hands that you think you got there with that is too good to fold, then you call. Otherwise, you can fold out a lot more hands, and you do so correctly. Because again, we talked about this before. If you're going to make mistakes, you want to make mistakes that ear towards, folding the best hand versus calling with the worst hand. Poker is not a game where you have complete information. So by definition, you're just going to make mistakes, right? So the question is, when you do make mistakes, which way do you want to err? Do you want to err towards the more risky side or the more conservative side? Now, let's look specifically at a situation when you're facing a very large bet on the river, okay? Your opponent may be bluffing, your opponent may have the nuts. If you are going to err one way or the other in terms of making a mistake, it's better to fold and make a mistake than it is to call and make a mistake. So overall, you want to lean slightly towards that. Again, when new information presents itself, a physical tell, tendencies of your opponents, but when it's an unknown and you're not really sure and it's a close spot, you're better off making the mistake. Again, maybe he'll show you a bluff and you folded the best hand. That's okay. That's still better in the long run than making the call, him showing you the nuts, and you scratching your head saying, well, I wish I would have saved that last bet. So if you're a beginner and you're watching this and you're thinking, well, should I be one of those people that's doing the overbet thing? And I would say that for now, just put that aside. It's a very complicated sort of, strategy because it's so dependent upon you being able to correctly incorporate blockers and your opponent's ranges in certain situations. And if you're a beginner, that's probably something that you're struggling with right now. So for you, if you're making value bets and you're making river bets, I would stick with something in the range of 2/3 to 3/4 of the pot.